we've seen that Australia's unemployment rate is at its lowest even compared to prior to COVID. We've been hearing about the phenomenon called the Great Resignation, where people are quitting their jobs in large numbers. Sometimes they're citing exhaustion or poor working conditions. Will this threaten our economic recovery?
I think it has the potential to, though I think it also has the potential to do some good things, the sorts of things that policymakers too rarely talk about, which I'll come back to in a second. Let me just begin by saying that it's a very good question for us to be focusing on, because first of all, I think one of the impacts of the pandemic, and I don't blame the people at the Bureau of Statistics and so forth who are doing the measurement, but we're told we have an unemployment rate of 4.2% at the moment, and yet the total number of employed Australians has only just in the last couple of months basically got back above where it was 2 years before, and it's barely above that. So that would normally, you would have expected us to have added close on 500,000 jobs by this stage. So we're actually at a situation, this goes to this point about people dropping out of the labour market, just not wishing to work or cutting back their hours, that there are, I think the 4.2% unemployment rate massively flatters the state of the economy. So again, we're in a situation where measured GDP is actually below where it was pre-pandemic. So, if you look at the unemployment rate and you think, wow, we haven't had a 4.2, there's only been a brief period pre the mining boom in 2007-8 where we ever got to that level. This looks like we have the hottest economy we've had in 30 years or something, but it's just giving you a misleading impression. And it's much more helpful these days to look at things like the employment to population ratio or the participation rate, how many people are actually in the market. And there you see a whole lot of people have dropped out or cut back. Again, it's very hard to measure because there are so many people who have been restricted on the supply side. They're told your business can't open or it has to work in a very restricted way. And this may not affect people as appropriately referred to somewhat disparagingly as the laptop class, the people who are able to work from home and carry on as normal. But there are a lot of jobs out there where people have been immensely disrupted and where small businesses also have been immensely disrupted. And I think there are a range of things going on, and I can only talk about this anecdotally, but my sense is there is something of this great reset going on. I think it's, again, much more pronounced in America than it has yet become in Australia, but I think it may become so. Part of that is there are a lot of people who are just fed up. They're fed up. They think this whole rat race that they got into, it was possible much more easily to believe that you were heading somewhere good and that this was a worthwhile investment of your time. And now for many small businesses, you see, you spent a decade or 2 decades setting up this business, and then the just on a whim edicts of government health bureaucrats and gutless politicians who hide behind them just took it all away from you. And they said, oh, we'll pay you some money to try to keep open or whatever. But for many people, that was an inadequate compensation. And in any case, they then are allowed to open up, then they're shut down again, then they're only allowed to do this with restrictions. There are all umpteen laws they have to fill in. They have to fill in all these forms and have government bureaucrats crawling all over their paperwork to determine if they're allowed to operate this basic business. There are a whole lot of people who will just give up, as it were, I think, or unless we do something dramatic to try to change the equation for them, who'll just say, there's no point trying to start a small business in Australia anymore. Why would I want to do that when I'm at the mercy of all this interference and regulation and gross, in my view, gross weighting of the costs versus the benefits, because that's the key point here. If we were dealing with the Black Plague or even with the Spanish flu, some of what the governments have done might have been justified, though even then they shouldn't have been continuing 2 years later on an emergency basis rather than being done through good order in democratic processes. But we were not dealing with that. We are not dealing with that now. We ought to have been focused on targeted measures at at-risk populations, and that would have meant that actually a whole lot of the restrictions we put in place would not have been made, and I think we would have been fine to do that. And a whole lot of people's livelihoods would not have been torn away from them or destroyed in that process. On top of that whole business, a whole lot of people thinking, why am I bothering? It's really tough to be in the private sector and try to make a crust these days. You also have the point that a whole lot of people have weighed up how tough it was, how they don't seem to be getting much of a return, how actually big business seems to be doing really well while they don't get much of a return. And many people may be also trying to reorganize their social lives as well. And so I think there may also be, I'd like to hope there might also be a modest element here of people saying a whole model of, husband and wife getting together, working their guts out to try to get enough to buy a house, etc., in, say, central Sydney, and to try to get ahead, maybe that's just the wrong approach to life. Maybe we ought to say, I'm actually going to go out to regional, Australia, try to find a house that costs a whole lot less, have one of us cut back, maybe whichever one, only work part-time, or maybe we can spend more time looking after the kids and having more of an actual family life. And actually, oddly enough, that will do bad things to measured GDP, but in the long run would be a really good development for Australia, in my view, not least because, again, we're sort of running out of time to discuss this, but there are really ominous demographic developments going on in Australia just in the last few years, really big shifts that no one is talking about, and that are really the things that policymakers ought to be focusing their time on and are not. And actually having the sort of shift I was just describing would be one of the ways of trying to address that. Actually, it would be an altogether good thing. So maybe some of this great reset might actually be, again, a sort of long-term benefit, even though it would seem to be a short-term cost.